This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome everyone once again to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam and I'm your host. And again, one of our favorite things to do on this podcast is to talk to interesting people from various walks of life in different areas of leadership. And today on the podcast, we've got a really special guest, Rob Blackaby, Dr. Rob Blackaby, who is Richard's cousin and is currently the president and professor of ethics at the Canadian Baptist Theological Seminary in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada. Obviously, Rob and Richard go way back, and so it's a really fun conversation just to drop in on, listen to what Rob has to say. He got his PhD from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's been the pastor of a church. He's been the head of a denominational convention. And this is a really fun conversation just to drop in on two people who've known each other for a very long time and just listen to the wisdom that they have to share and the different aspects of leadership that they both bring to the table. And I think you'll get a lot of encouragement from this conversation with Rob Blackaby. And with that, I'll turn it over to Richard.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's podcast. And again, I have my very special favorite type of podcast today with a special guest. And this is not just any special guest. This is one of my very favorite people on the face of the planet. And that is my cousin, Rob Blackaby. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
And Rob, for those of you that may not know him, when I left being the president of the seminary in Canada in 1990, no, when was that? 2006. Yes, I got there in 93. Rob ultimately took my place, and he is still there, and he surpassed my tenure. I think served now for 15 years and counting. And Rob's father was the younger brother of my father, and so we have a lot of in common. I say Rob is more of a brother than a cousin to me. And so Rob has a PhD in ethics and is just a wealth of thought and information on that. And so I thought that today we would have Rob take us through a bit of a discussion on ethics. But first, I need to ask two things. One is just tell us a little bit about your journey, Rob. How did you end up from growing up in Vancouver, Canada, to be sitting in the Blackaby Studios podcast booth today, so many years later?
In a nutshell, yeah. I spent the first 23 years of my life in a great home. I had the privilege of being raised in a great home with my dad, Will, Mom, Marg, and raised in a great church family. 23 years old, moved to Texas, where I went to graduate school. And then in 1995, my wife and I moved to Calgary to pastor a church that had existed for a while. It had a few members and stayed there for 13 years, and then ended up at the seminary in 2007.
You've just about got that mess you inherited cleaned up now, I think. Now, Rob, his dad, Will, passed away early last year.
Yeah.
He was to me the epitome of an uncle. He was always laughing, always had a joke, always had a grin on his face. Always had some memorable, teachable comment that he would dispense. And so I told Rob beforehand that we've got to have just a couple of Uncle Will stories because I just know a lot about Rob and his siblings, and they were deeply, deeply impacted by their dad. And Rob, you have a great heritage. You have so faithfully served the Lord. Your kids are walking with the Lord. But I think you would be like me, and you would trace back so much of that to your dad, your mom too. But I know your dad was just a very impactful kind of person, like my dad was. My dad was a pastor. Your dad was a counselor in public school system, which was incredible. In a very secular public school system, he regularly brought a Christian influence. And so do you have a story too? Just like, how did he speak into your life? We're going to talk about character, ethics in this episode, but so much of what formed you, I think, came from the impact your dad had on you.
Yeah, I think you say he epitomizes uncle. For me, he epitomizes dad. You know, and I think there was this incredible consistency in his life. I'm trying to remember, did dad ever sit me down and say, in a 2-hour period, Rob, this is what you must believe? And I'm sure across my lifespan, he spoke into my life multiple times. I remember some of those, but most of it was maybe the vast majority of it was walks, car rides, where he would just be speaking life, and you just watched it. It mirrored actually how he lived. And I've wondered, I was a deacon's kid. You were a pastor's kid. I was a deacon's kid. I know plenty of deacon's kids who don't want anything to do with the church. They don't want anything to do with the Lord. What is it about my dad's and my mom's life that me and my siblings, we want to really lean heavy into the things of the Lord?
Yeah.
We think the church is the best group of people to be around.
Because you were dragged to church a lot growing up,
yeah.
and it could easily have resented that.
Yeah.
Your dad was like mine, probably went overboard at times in service at the church.
Yeah.
And so you could easily said, hey, he cared more about the church than us or whatever, but you didn't think that way.
No, I think he involved us in ministry with him. Mom and dad would, not always, but often, we would be with them whatever ministry they were engaged with. Obviously not committee meetings, by God's grace. but
it could have been worse.
For what? Over 3 decades, they led youth ministry for almost the same amount of time, maybe a little bit more, and my dad led a boys ministry. And so if they were doing a youth event, we would be there with them. Even though we were too young to be youth, we would just watch it. I think since my dad's death, I've been thinking about him and what was some of those ingredients that, at his death, people were paying tribute to him. And I think one of those was, Dad had really strong opinions. He could be inflexible, but there was something about him that he just projected a safe place. He projected, if you don't have anywhere else that you belong, you can belong with Will Blackaby. So they had people in their home sharing, intimate parts of their life, and Dad just journeyed with them. And so, again, and what I realize more and more as I get older is how much of my life Dad just sprinkled Scripture, especially Proverbs, but not just Proverbs, And so if I had an issue that I was trying to work through, he just breathed down. It was like he stored God's word in his heart, and at the right time, God just brought it out of that treasure chest for his son. Like he would just share a proverb or a verse, which tells me again, like he didn't just. It wasn't just a Sunday or a momentary thing. It was his life. His Bible was always open on his nightstand. Like I could go on and on. On his way to work, I'll tell you one more thing. He'd get home from work, and often around the dinner table, he would tell a story from the day, and then before he'd tell us what he did, he'd say, "Well, guys, what would you do?" And then we give our ideas, and he'd say, "Oh, that's really good. Do you want to know what I did?" And please, give us the answer, invite us in, because here he is in the middle of a very secular context. And he's finding ways on the way to work every day. His prayer was, God, what one person do you want me to interact with today? And he'd spend the day, he'd just expect that God was going to raise that person to his awareness and that he would speak into their life. Anyway, so those kind of things, I think, demonstrated to all of us that it wasn't just for Dad a religion. It was a philosophy of life. It was the way he oriented himself.
And he said many times, he'd say, now my brother Henry was called to be a pastor.
Yeah,
I was called to be a teacher, counselor, and he felt just as called.
Yeah.
And so many things he did. I remember him just saying, if there was maybe a troubled kid in school, and he's going to have to, he's being consigned to go spend some time with the counselor. He would say to the kid, "Hey, what class would you really like to cut today? I'll schedule to meet with you then." Right. And he just became a friend and a confidant. And whether you agreed with everything he said or not, you knew that this guy was a good guy that had your best interests at heart. And so many people just opened up to him, and he found a way. And so
he saw people like that. That would be a big thing about Dad, is he really, as far as I know in the Bible, the first name that a human gives to God is the God who sees. God values us knowing that he sees us.
Yeah.
And Dad modeled that. He saw people. And again, I think that gave people a sense that, if I don't have anywhere else in this world that I belong, I can belong with Will Blackaby. I can be part of his team, his family. And so he collected a lot of us.
It's one last just thing, the story about him. When I was the president of the seminary, we tried every year to have a little focus to help parents. If you were a seminary student, and we'd bring in some parenting, a conference. And I think for 2 years we brought in Will. And I remember the first time Will came in, and he's just sharing all this wealth of stuff that he's helped folks with for decades. And but he was funny, and he was kind of like everybody's uncle, you know. And at a certain point, I think we'd had this great session. We're stopping for a break, and some seminary wife got tears in her eyes. She came over and said, "I need an Uncle Will."
Yeah.
And I thought he was sort of like everybody's uncle kind of thing. But
that I will, if you'll indulge me, that is one of the earliest things that I observed in my dad. I would say as a preteen, that I thought, I don't know how he does it, but I wish I could be like that. And that is, whenever he came in a room, you'd see smiles and laughter as he was walking, literally like a wave as he's walking through the room. And as he goes out the other side, that room is a warmer place. It's a happier place. Somehow he just, and I would imagine if you were to say, "Will, what are you, like, do you get up in the morning and just kind of come up with these things?" I think he did. It was no effort. It was just the Spirit of God working through him to bring encouragement into people's lives.
Yeah, and I maybe the last thing to say with that, I know I speak for you and for me. We highly respect our fathers, but we're very familiar with their flaws, their feet of clay, and I think it's always important just to point out that you can be that kind of person that lights up a room and still be human. You don't have to be superhuman to do that. These are ordinary people with feet of clay that just were sold out for God to use them, and they didn't always get things right, but they got it right enough that people really came to appreciate them. And so had to just get a bit of Uncle Will in there, just because every time I'm around you, we at some point reminisce a little bit about our dads. And but Rob, I think it's certainly obvious that ethics has become a hot button in some ways, especially when you see leaders falling in spectacular fashion and scandals being exposed, it seems, every week. We know that ethics are important, and yet, I think for most people, ethics are one of those things that we just sort of assume are just there. It's like, I just believe this, but I think the average person, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say the average person probably has never just sat down and systematically thought through, what is my ethic? What is it I believe, and how I should live my life, how I should treat others. And so I want you just to kind of help us a bit, and we'll just kind of move into this subject. But there's a difference between theology and ethics, isn't there? How would you distinguish theology and ethics?
I would think, let me reach back to my dad and bring this segue forward. Because it's important to me, because I remember when I was starting to sense I needed to do some more advanced study. What area was I going to study in? And talking over with my dad, and I thought I was really growing or developing a passion for ethics, and my dad was so affirming and said, "Rob, I think that ethics is going to be something that the church really needs to look at in the future, because the issues that are coming at us are the pace at which they're coming at us. And he was inside of a very secular public school system. He's going, the pace at which issues are coming up in the church, we need somebody to help navigate us through that. So another area of gratitude to my father. I think ethics is the natural expression of theology. I think they have to, one needs to flow into the other. So theology, if it's left on its own, is incomplete. Because historically, ethics has been called practical theology or practical philosophy, but often practical theology. So if this is what I believe to be true, if this is what the Bible exposes reality to be like, then how should that affect what I live or how I live, right? So what ought I or ought I not to do? What's right or wrong, good or evil? That's ethics.
Yeah, and it's like, well, my theology tells me that all people are created in the image of God,
Right.
But then I have to take that to an ethic to say, so can I discriminate against people? Can I tear people down? And I've said this often. I minored in theology in seminary. I really found it fascinating. But when I got to the church, it was ethics that just about ate my lunch in terms of like issues coming up in the church with people and coming to me saying, is this right? Or does the Bible allow me to do this? And it was not the theological questions that, ethics, it just seems like can be so gray sometimes. And it's like, well, this verse says this, and that verse says that. And so can I, do this in my marriage, or can I do this at my workplace? And but there's you said something interesting the other day too. You sort of distinguish between ethics and morals,
Right?
And how would you? To me, that would seem like the same thing. But how do you distinguish those?
Yeah, and it can be used the same way. But if you're going to make a distinction, and I prefer to make a distinction, I think ethics is my system of what I believe is what I ought or ought not to do. It's like I say, it's the belief system that's flowing out of my theology. This is how I ought to live. But morals is how I'm actually living, right? So my morality is a description of the way that Rob actually goes about living his life. And my problem is when my morality, my actual expression of what I believe, and my ethics, when they're inconsistent, we have a real problem as far as the integrity that we have when we speak to the world that's all around us, the culture that we're embedded in. And I think it's not a new crisis. I think it can be a crisis in the church when our morality and what we profess to be our ethics don't match up. The other thing I'd say is we're all moral. Like there's no such thing as an amoral person. We're all moral people. The question is, what is the basis of my morality? And for Christians, it ought to be a theology that's rooted in Scripture and clearly articulated in an ethical system. Like this is what we will or will not do. So to go to your point, discriminate. Well, should we discriminate? Well, I think biblically, yes, we actually do discriminate. We do say this is right and this is wrong. But does that affect how I behave toward people? Again, it can be tough.
Yeah.
Christian life, I don't know why, somewhere along the way as a young man, I thought, Christian life ought to be easy. But, reading Luther said, try to get your head around, I'm grossly paraphrasing, but trying to get your head around the book of Romans, like he said he beat importunately against Paul, it's hard work.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting with Luther, he didn't even think the book of James should be in the Bible. And yet a lot of James was kind of ethics. It was all about, well, how do you treat the poor and and that kind of thing. And Luther he had this sort of pristine theology of salvation by grace through faith. And so it looked like there was too much works. But yet James was really trying to get an ethic to say, well, if we're all created in the image of God, why do you fawn over this wealthy visitor to your church you are rude to the poor visitor to your church? And so I find that that for a lot of us, I just see a lot of homespun kind of ethics that we've never really tried to be consistent with. So,
Right.
You see this today, like you might say, well, I just think that it's wrong to discriminate against the poor. The poor should be given opportunities and equal opportunities and so on. And sometimes people want them to have equal outcomes, and they'll say, because I just think it's just justice, and I believe in justice. But then the next breath they'll say, so I think we need to take money from the rich and give it to the poor, for justice sake. And you say, but is that just to the rich? I mean, they earn that money, they own that property, and you're just taking it from them. You're taxing it or whatever. Is that justice? Well, it's justice because the poor deserve it. It's like, well, so your form of justice gives justice to the poor, not the rich. And so is that a consistent ethic across the board, or is it more of an arbitrary justice? Like, I think you should care about the poor, but does that mean, can you develop an ethic that is just for everyone, not just certain segments? And so, there's just a number of issues like that. If you were going to say to someone, take a look at your ethic, and it may be pretty haphazard as well. You might really feel strongly about this, but then over here, you're quite careless and not consistent at all. I think as Christians have the opportunity, I mean, it's not easy, but I think they have at least the challenge to be consistent across the board. So you treat everybody as created in the image of God and everybody deserving of justice and so on. So how would you, if someone were saying, I need to really think through that. I need to, I need to kind of put down on paper, what is it I value, and I think is important for me to follow in my own conduct. How would you do that? How would you put that together?
So here are some of the choke points that I think we have. First of all is, if we're issue driven, we could get ourselves in trouble pretty quick because just your example of justice, right? So I'm using contemporary categories. So I'm speaking, you are, from versions of a capitalistic. I mean, I'm in Canada, you're in the United States, but we're talking about versions of a capitalistic society, and so then how do you take? My temptation is to say, oh, here's a great verse. Well, but is that what that verse actually teaches? Is that what that passage actually teaches? So I think that's where the hard work comes in. Just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean I have a Christian ethics. Just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean I'm living Christian morality. Just because I go to church and because my pastor tells me to do something doesn't mean that it's biblically informed. So the hard work for me is, okay, what is going on behind the issues, those root virtues, those root vices? What does the Bible have to say about justice? And then before we get to justice, what does the Bible have to say about love? Like, what's the biblical definition of love? Because love's still a very popular word, but we don't use it even in Christian circles like the Bible, I think, would define it. Love is a choice towards another person. It's whether you deserve it or not, I act towards you, and that's love. It's not a romantic feeling.
And again, it can become very arbitrary. I'm really focused on loving this kind of person, but then I'm being unloving over here. And
and love isn't sentimental, and I fear that we can live our lives today in a way that we just wait for this sentimental feeling to be stirred, and now that's love. Well, no, it's not actually sentimental. It can be. Like I mean, I know that there's expressions, but at its core, love is a commitment. It's a commitment to another, whether you deserve it or not. I'm going to behave this way. I think, well, what does that look like? That's the question. God gives us the answer in how he behaves toward us in Scripture. It's all from the front to the back of the Scriptures. We're given what love looks like in action. And so we say, well, what do you do with the law? Well, the law is a great description of what God's love looks like in action.
And ethic will describe things that you don't do. We see it negative, but it's hard to have ethics and then just be able to do anything you want. I think you and I both are our parents modeled for us. There's just certain things it wouldn't cross their mind to do because that was just not their ethics to do that, and they had settled that a long time ago. Right. Well, maybe one other question here. Just I'll just kind of I'll just stir the pot just a little bit here for a moment. But when you look, I mean, ethical issues change over time. Like I remember, like when I was in seminary, divorce was a big issue. Like, can you have been divorced and be a pastor? And that kind of thing, or will God still? Have you disqualified yourself from serving the Lord in a official capacity? And there are issues like that if you're divorced, can you remarry and all that kind of thing. And there were some heated discussions among seminary students during that time, but a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since then. And so when you look at folks today trying to develop an ethic, and you and I both have young adult children that we're trying to help encourage as they enter this world, and they're now my kids are all raising kids of their own, and you look at the morals, the culture in which they're raising their kids, and you say, now how are you going to raise your kids in a way that when the world just bombards them with its values and ethical perspectives, that they've got their own biblical ethics so firmly entrenched that they're not just blown away.
Right.
And so, like, what are some of the issues right now that you just see kind of front and center that as Christians we're going to have to really process biblically in the days to come?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question, but first I want to say that I really believe when you're saying, okay, I need to have a system of ethics. A system of ethics is going to inform my morality. It's going to inform how I'm living my life. And so I need to know in advance, these are the decisions I'm going to make. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I've got it, and I think sometimes we struggle because we put it all in the same, like, this is the decision and these are the implications, these are the changes that I'm going to have to make. Let's separate that out. Okay, so this is what I ought and ought not to do. So now the situation comes to me and I think, okay, my decision's already been made. I'm not going to do that. Okay, so now I've got, okay, so then what are the implications for that? What does it look like now as I live this out? And that's where I think you have to say, okay, so I can't relax the ought or the ought not in my life, but I certainly need to see people. I certainly need to be compassionate to people. So what is one of the issues? I got to be honest with you. I think going forward for the evangelical community right now, I'm tempted to get into social issues. I think, what does it look like to be the people of Christ right now who live with compassion, clarity, who we're not defensive, we're not threatened. So that is, to me, one of the issues right now, is that we're tempted to adopt postures that are belligerent, that are mean or mean-spirited or angry, and I'm familiar with, because I'm told, well, there is a biblical anger. Agreed, there is a biblical anger. But it's towards unrighteousness, it's ungodliness, it's towards the abuse of the marginalized. It's that biblical anger, as far as I see it expressed in Christ, is not because Jesus' rights were offended. He laid down his rights. Mm-hmm. That may not seem like an ethical issue, but to me personally it is, because as we weigh into some of these very specific targeted issues that are going to continue to grow more complex, who we are as God's people is going to be paramount. Mm-hmm. How we conduct ourselves in our culture is going to be paramount. Mm-hmm. Are we actually giving evidence of the fruits of the kingdom of darkness in Galatians 5, or are we exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit?
Well, and I think ethics, a lot of why you have ethics is because you don't want to hurt people. I mean, you don't want to take advantage, exploit them, and because you care about people, you want to conduct yourself with other people in a way that with high ethics, high standards, and yet oftentimes ethics can become a club where you just condemn everyone that doesn't practice what you do, and And so it's almost ironic that you're getting it becomes a club when it should have been a way for you to practice love toward people.
And I think there's certain virtue in having clarity. Like, to me, the biblical word of understand, if you go through the Bible and highlight every time that word understand is used in the Old and the New Testament, it's all over the place. So theology is it's important that we understand who God reveals himself to be accurately, and we don't misrepresent him. And it's why we do a lot of heavy work in the Scripture. It's like, because I don't want to get in a pulpit and tell people this is who God is. If God says, I'm just reading through Jeremiah right now, and one of the condemnations against those prophets is, I never told you that. I never said that's what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And so destruction's coming on the people because you misrepresented me.
Wow.
And so it's important that we understand who God reveals himself to be in his word. It's important that we understand what that means for what I believe we ought or ought not to do. It's important that I understand how I ought to live out my life. But all of that should be cloaked in grace and biblical love and mercy and compassion. I mean, that's one of God's self-descriptions, is I'm a compassionate God. Would people look at God's people and say that? You're a compassionate people. I'm not sure. And that's a shame.
Yeah. Well, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to ethics, and I think it's only becoming more complicated in culture today. Issues that we never would have even imagined 20 years ago that now my 8-year-old grandsons are facing when they go to school, even in Christian schools. And so I think it behooves us, I think, as families, as couples, as leaders, to have thought through to say, so what is important, and let's get to the root, and let's think this through before I need to. I can't do quick, catch up here. Once all of a sudden an issue walks in the door, and I haven't had time to think about it. So, I knew our time would race by, Rob, and this is going to be a 2-part series, because I've got you here in the studio and I want to pick your brain. And so, we've kind of gotten in here in this first podcast with just some of the big issues, the broad issues. But in the next episode, we're going to talk very specifically about leaders and how to create a culture in your organization with high ethics, and how to navigate a world, whether you're leading a business or a church, some kind of organization, in a way that is ethical as you lead a very diverse workforce. And so, Rob, thanks for being with us, and I look forward to talking with you further in episode 2.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.